So back in January, music fans were dealt a huge blow with news of the passing of Neil Peart, the legendary drummer for Rush. Back in May, we spoke with author Martin Popoff about Anthem, Rush in the 70s, his first in a trilogy of books about the band. Now he's back to talk about book 2, which is Limelight, Rush in the 80s. If Anthem was about the band's initial rise to fame, Limelight looks at Rush at the height of its fame, building the legacy it still enjoys among fans today. So welcome back to the bookshelf, Martin.
Yeah, thanks, John. Very cool. Thanks.
Martin, when we last spoke, the band had just gone through the difficult recording of their 6th album, Hemispheres, which in a way marks the end of one era for the band, but then sets them up for another, i.e. the 1980s. Is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, basically that record was the, as they say, the straw that broke the camel's back, and they decided to write in sort of a shorter format, trying to hone their songwriting a little bit, and The Spirit of Radio was a good start of that, although they kind of threw everything but the kitchen sink into it anyways, but basically the songs were all shorter. It just had a little bit of a more modern feel. I suppose it's still pretty progressive, but moving away from sort of 70s themes and just kind of with this eye to the future, I suppose.
Now, yeah, one thing as I noticed as a listener, and you just touched upon this, is the shorter song structures and the music being more reflective of the times. No one would accuse the band of being trend chasers, shall we say, but clearly the dawn of the 80s showed that these guys didn't exactly exist in a vacuum either.
No, and they didn't go new wave of British heavy metal. They never went hair metal, so they went other ways. I mean, in certain ways they did somewhat chase trends in that they were always after kind of the latest technology and using that technology to the fullest, and that's kind of later on. But at this point, they're just essentially kind of becoming a little more direct, a little more focused, and deciding that huge sort of, all those trappings of prog that started way back in 1970 with Yes and Genesis and Jethro Tull and all that, they're going to basically do away with that stuff.
Now, Permanent Waves sees them flirting with popularity in a way they hadn't before. The Spirit of Radio seems to have opened a lot of doors for them. Why was this song so important? How do you put this in context in the catalog?
Well, I think it's kind of neat that it's about radio. I mean, it's a really good lyric. I mean, that's not unexpected being Neil Peart, but it's also, I mean, there's this energy to it, this bubbly sort of buoyant drive to the song. It also has that little bit of reggae feel, so it's got a little bit of humor to it. It's got that neat part where it sounds like they're turning the radio dial, and that's where you get like kind of all that different music in sort of a rapid succession. But basically it's just hooky and enjoyable. It's flashy, but yeah, it does keep it short. I mean, it's almost like they figured out how to sell this complicated music and make it accessible and make it radio friendly, and the fact that it's written about radio certainly didn't hurt either.
Of course, Permanent Waves and The Spirit of Radio are kind of a dry run for Moving Pictures and Tom Sawyer. Many would say, and have said, this is the band at the peak of its powers. Would you agree?
I would say so. I mean, essentially that entire side became massive hit singles. I mean, or pretty big hit singles. I mean, even YYZ or YYZ here in Canada, of course, as an instrumental is a single that's played on classic rock radio. But Limelight was a massive song. Red Barchetta you hear all the time. And, of course, Tom Sawyer, their biggest song, which is again a really neat idea in that they made this accessible song, but it's still a progressive rock song. It's just not super long. And one of the neat things about it is how the meter is kind of slow on it. Yet, Neil would always famously say it's actually really hard to play properly, and he always found it a challenge. And even Geddy and Alex have to play complicated things in it, yet they're playing slow. So it's kind of a neat challenge that they put up for themselves. And then the whole second side, I mean, aren't particularly hit singles, but they're all really well recorded songs as well. And you've got that classy kind of regal looking black and red album cover. And yeah, basically also, as Neil says, they became the it band. They became the band, in the high school hallways that everybody's saying, oh, going to the Rush concert tonight, that kind of thing, right? So yeah, this is when they broke it wide open.
high school hallways, that's a good segue to my next question. So we go from moving pictures to signals and the beginning or a continuation of a shift to keyboards and synthesizers and influences like new wave and even reggae pop up more and more in their music. How did the band handle the changes around them around Signals time?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, this is going to mark the exit of Terry Brown as their producer, but this record was not that well received because of those, more synthesizers in it, and it just seemed like a little bit softer, rounder record. It wasn't quite as explosive or exciting as Moving Pictures. At this point, there's probably even a little backlash that maybe Rush is getting too big for their britches. They're getting too famous, sort of thing. The press tends to have a little bit of that reaction, even if it's in the subconscious somewhat. But basically, it was kind of badly received. New World Man was seen as too derivative of the Police and bringing in the reggae stuff and just being a little too poppy and maybe even a little silly. Subdivisions is pretty well received, but again, it's driven by a synthesizer riff. So they are changing, not changing super rapidly. I mean, it still bears some of the hallmarks of the previous record. Alex is still pretty present in it. I really like it a lot. But they are, at a time when they could have gone heavier, like new wave of British heavy metal or the start of, the heavy metal that's sort of starting in California, they do start going the other way. So it was quite a surprise to a lot of people.
Now, the keyboard thing, as you mentioned, kind of breaks open some differences in the band, from my reading of it anyway. Alex Lifeson struggling to find a space for the guitar along the keyboards in the sound spectrum, as it were. While to me it also seems that Geddy's role in the band is getting even larger.
Yeah, definitely. This is when Geddy is really having the quote unquote hands full. He's standing there. He's got a bass strapped on, live, but he's surrounded by ever growing banks of keyboards and things to do with them, and bass pedals and things to trigger. So his job is getting kind of less fun, even for him. Although more creatively, interesting and creatively actualizing, while Alex is, again, as you said, rightly, he's kind of moving forward with the times as well, and he's always a guy who's looking for different sort of sounds, and that's always a for better or worse thing. I always think of Joe Perry when I think of this as well, where he's always kind of looking for different sounds, and so he never kind of has his own sound. He's always looking for the next sort of bell and whistle deal. And Alex is moving forward again, into that chimey Duran Duran, The Fix sort of feel. He never saw himself really as a riffster, and the riffs are becoming less and less often at this point because he is competing with basically a second rhythm guitar in the form of whatever tonalities and textures Geddy or how prominent he's trying to insert some sort of a synthesizer thing in there as a riff. So Alex has kind of got this. It's becoming kind of a four-piece band at this point, and that means less of a role for Alex.
I wasn't going to mention Joe Perry because it's a bit of a detour, but there is a funny story in the book that you tell about the Joe Perry project opening up for Rush at the height of their fame, Moving Pictures time. Joe Perry not exactly at the height of his fame with his solo project, and Geddy killing him with kindness in retaliation from when Rush was a baby band opening up for Aerosmith.
Yeah, that's a pretty neat story, and it just kind of shows the edge that Geddy can kind of have, right? This idea, but he's also, he's trying to prove a point here. Aerosmith was famously one of these bands that were never very good to their backup bands, and Steven Tyler regretted that later, and he started apologizing to people, right? But basically, whether it's the drug or the drink or whatever, or just being irascible people, in that era that happened a lot, anyways. But Aerosmith were particularly bad at it, and obviously not good to these guys. And now Joe Perry's got his Joe Perry project, which their manager David Krebs is a good buddy of mine. He explained to me that literally that band happened because Joe had a very large room service bill all the time at the hotels, and he had to pay off his room service bill. He was going broke basically by living an extravagant lifestyle, so they had to start the Joe Perry project. So there he is, backing him up, and Geddy's basically showering all these lavish favors on him, and basically at the end of it saying, yeah, so this is what you're supposed to do, not what you guys used to do.
If you know David Krebs, you should get him to write a book, because I would read that.
Oh, we've talked about it at length all the time. He phones me. We have these long conversations all the time, and I try to coax him into it. I've got lots and lots and lots of phone calls, but the problem is he's not so good on the details after a while. Like to drag enough good substance out of him takes a long time.
All right, great side detour there. Okay, well, getting back to the book though. There's the break with the longtime producer Terry Brown that you mentioned. Was it a case of simply growing apart, or you mentioned specific instances during the recording of Signals where it looks like the relationship was starting to fray a bit?
Yeah, it's growing apart and growing to the point where these guys want to keep creatively moving forward rapidly, and for that they needed a new fourth wheel on this vehicle, on this red Barchetta, and basically they wanted somebody who would challenge them and disagree with them and push them forward into different realms. And they figure, Terry basically, they love him and he grew up with them, but he's not any different from them, and that's simply the problem there. So, it was somewhat of an amicable split, with a little bit of uneasiness, of course, that would be necessary. But essentially, they wanted people to bring in fresh ideas that reflected their growing interest in what was going on in the rest of music, which is basically post-punk music, really, post-punk and new wave. Not punk, not heavy metal, not what the other prog bands are doing, although certainly they were probably seeing, a similar parallel idea that was happening with Yes and Genesis, almost like a way forward in a way. But they did not want to be Marillion. They didn't want to be kind of an old-fashioned prog band in this new age. They wanted to, marry all the new technologies with what they'd learned and become more succinct and focused as songwriters.
We talk about this move to the keyboards, and it's funny you mentioned that they wanted someone to challenge them a bit and to have an opinion, and then enter Peter Henderson and move and Grace Under Pressure, and not exactly what they were. It ended up being a lot tougher than they. Let's just say they bit off more than they could chew.
Yeah, and essentially what happened is there's still, the bad situation of they were essentially stood up by Steve Lillywhite, and, who knows where the record would have gone at that point. It's fascinating to think about. But so they made this record, and one of their memories is just how hard it was, how much pulling teeth, and how freezing cold it was when they were making it outside in the winter in Canada. And the big problem with Peter Henderson is he did not offer a lot of strong opinions. He almost kind of just went with the flow and went with what those guys wanted. And these guys, one of their main things is that they wanted somebody to bring new ideas to them and produce the heck out of them rather than just kind of like, be thinking along the same lines. So, I think it's a good record, and a lot of people like it. I think it's a good favorite. It often gets forgotten. And it's, I almost don't even see it as a transition record, in some sort of a sensible straight line from Signals to Power Windows. It just seems like a record apart, doing kind of a whole bunch of different things. So that's kind of interesting about it. It doesn't feel like something along a line.
Now, we talk about this mid-'80s keyboards period. What was the most interesting thing that you learned in researching this era?
Boy, I would say how much Peter Collins really affected the band, and how much they acceded to his views, and how his views, surprisingly, they just seem in bad taste to me. Essentially, he wanted to bring this wiry sort of English, mid-rangey, yangy sound to them, and he thought it was good music, and I really don't think it's good music, and I don't think it dates well. And he brought this to Rush, and I was surprised to see that they wanted that out of him. They kind of got what they wanted out of him, but he's Mr. Big, and essentially I guess he convinced them that this was good music, but they kind of believed it anyways. And I think it almost shows a collaboration of bad taste, because I think this stuff did not date so well. The 70s stuff kind of, it didn't even have to come full circle. No one ever thought the 70s stuff was embarrassing. It always was kind of looked upon as okay, and still now I think those sounds and the creative decisions they made are looked upon as timeless, truly timeless, like outside of time, like this will always sound good. But the 80s stuff, still the verdict is out. It's never had its cool period. It may have its cool period at one point, but I just find it surprising that they had this taste in music, as did this producer, and so they went away and made what sensibly you would make, and I don't know if it's great music.
It's interesting you say that, because if I think of their catalog as a whole, something like Hemispheres ages a lot better than, say, Power Windows or definitely Hold Your Fire, which is probably the most dated, I would think, of all that stuff.
Yeah. So it's this, I tried to get this answer out of Nancy Wilson the other day, but we didn't have a lot of time, and these were short answers. We couldn't really explore it. But I kind of wondered, and I'm going to probably have this debate when I do my own podcast or whatever at some point. But I wonder if those 70s sounds are timeless, or they just sound good. Like, which is it? Are they truly timeless? Do they just sound good? Did they ever have a period when they didn't sound good? I don't know. I mean, Neil looked great with his handlebar mustache and long hair, right? I mean, that never looked lousy, right? I mean, and yet, the various haircuts and things they tried later on, whether it was the 80s or the 90s, like, people look back on that stuff and snicker, but they don't really snicker. They snicker a little bit at the kimonos and that, but they don't really. I mean, it's still in the back of their mind. People are saying, well, actually, that's kind of cool. So yeah, it's funny. It's an interesting debate to have, but I totally agree with you. You move into Power Windows and Hold Your Fire, and you've got the Steinberger basses and the wall basses and the Simmons drums and the, and all that stuff just is grating on the ear.
So by decade's end, we have another live album and a new studio album, and then a new label for them stateside. How does the book set us up for the era that is to come?
Well, the era that is to come is so different from what just happened. I mean, what just happened is essentially a rock band going to work, albeit changing creatively quite rapidly. But as the third book opens, they're basically going to make the same sort of record they made on Presto. I mean, Roll the Bones is basically the paired album to Presto. But then things change, Counterparts. Things change some more, Test for Echo. Neil's tragedies hit. Unfortunately, we have a lot of tragedy that enters into the band, and this generally is a period where they're starting to spread out a little more, and they're looking inside themselves introspectively, like, is this all there is to life? Is this what there is to life? And they explore and become better versions of the Renaissance men that they kind of thought they might be at some point as they moved through the 80s, but essentially they become much more well-rounded rock and roll aristocrats through the 90s, and make a bunch of very different records again. And then, I mean, the third book actually takes us right up to the end, so we go right through the 2000s, and more stuff happens, and more interesting records, and a concept record, and Vapor Trails, very passionate, deep, dark record, really, just soul-wrenching lyrics and a very different sound for them. We get the Hall of Fame, we get going, Rush in Rio, we get lots and lots of live albums, reissues, we get that whole thing. So yeah, the third book is quite colorful because a lot happens. It literally covers 30 years. Yeah, is it 30? Yeah, 30 years, in the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, versus, the first two books is just 10 years each.
Are you under a particular pressure to keep the length of the third book around the same as books 1 and 2?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't under any pressure, but it actually just kind of worked out the same way. And I was wondering that this morning, how long it was. I can't quite remember how long it is, but I think it might be the longest of the three, but not by a lot. There's no radically different size to the thing, because I mean, the thing I always like to write about the most is the records themselves. So when they start spreading them out so much over time, it's actually less going on than it looks like, kind of thing.
So when we sum up the 80s then, 7 studio albums, 2 live albums in 9 years, a brisk pace if nothing else, and you really hit it on the head earlier when you said the 80s is Rush, it's a band going to work.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely is. I mean, they're wearing themselves out. They've got these massive shows. Every show at this point is a hockey barn, whether that's an A city or a B city. They're headlining a hockey barn. They're headlining everything. I mean, everything's a headline show. So they're basically a big band. They're comfortable. They've made some money now. They're basically a big going concern going to work.
All right, that's a fine place to leave it. The name of the book, Limelight, Rush in the 80s. My thanks to Martin Popoff. The book is available from ECW Press. Thanks for this, sir.
Awesome. Thank you.